Hello, I am Greg Livingston, aka Golem, and I am here with the developer of Explobers. Please introduce yourself.
My name is John D. Moore. I am the developer for Explobers as well as a few dozen other games.
Yeah, I saw your website said it had quite a number of games.
I just released, I think, my 92nd last week.
Whew. How long have you been at this?
That's a total of games that I've put on the internet since 1997. So since I was 14,
Wow.
2 decades of games. There's a big gap in the middle there where I wasn't making that many, or didn't make some for a few years. But I've been doing it. I mean, I was doing it on paper before I ever started doing it in. Well,
Huh. Yeah, I think that's something maybe we all do as kids is make up our own games on paper, but not all of us take it into development.
I used to try to model little strategy guides, like the Nintendo strategy guides I'd get. I design levels that way.
That's so cool. Anyway, how would you describe Explobers?
Explobers, probably the best, most succinct way I can think to describe it is it's a little bit like Lemmings mashed up with the Lost Vikings. Those are kind of the two main like mechanical impulses. Basically, you have a number of characters in a given stage. Those characters have specific powers, and you have to guide them to the exit. There are two different kinds of powers. One character can explode terrain. Another character can become a block that can float in the air. The other characters can use as a platform. And then another character that can use either power can be its destiny. And you have a finite number of them that you have to strategically use, alternating between them to get them to collaborate to get you to the end of the stage. It's a large game. It's a total of 80 stages in the main game, tricky puzzle platforming, all based around destructible terrain.
Yeah, about the destructible terrain, the Lost Vikings comparison is interesting because in that game you have the three characters with abilities that offset one another, but it's more like they all have their own individual interactions. There's the guy who can jump, the guy who can block stuff, and the guy who has a sword, and they all are kind of doing their own thing. Whereas in Explobers, each of the three characters is talking in the language of tiles, where the red guy erases tiles, the blue guy creates tiles, and the green guy can do either. So there's a certain elegance or concision to Explobers.
Unlike Lost Vikings, you end up actually, generally speaking, putting your characters in really disparate parts of the level. Whereas Explorers, more often than not, you kind of have to cluster them together and then like send one out as an emissary to go out and take care of a task and kind of keep the group together. For the most part, there are different stages where I try to ask the player to get away from that kind of play. But I think the main sort of thing that I aim is that they're really working in tight coordination with each other. Yeah.
I guess the exception that proves the rule there, I actually just played a level where there's a path upwards that you have to explode through and a path below where you have to build a bridge over spikes, and so it's a level where the different colors kind of each have their own path.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, there's kind of in my mind there's kind of basic kind of what Explorers does, which is getting all the characters together to work in tandem with each other, to use their different powers. They kind of trottle on this path together. But then there's ones like you said, and that was very much something that I aimed for to try to think about different ways that I could get the player to move the characters. So yeah, there'll be different ones.
Okay. And actually, I'm speaking with you because I went to the Smithsonian American Art Museum arcade this past weekend, and, well, your games was one of the games on show there. The theme of the arcade was game spaces, and I was wondering how Explobers fits that theme.
That was interesting because as a person who I think I released 6 games last year, I was wondering what I had that could possibly fit that theme. And Explorers was my biggest game last year, and it seemed to me that for me it's all about level design. One of the ideas was not that, like when Sam Arcade put out the pitch, it was both games that make interesting use of space in terms of like community or transform the space where the game is played, or level design. And for me, Explobers is a game of really simple mechanical elements. There's really not that much variety in terms of the kind of things you run into in the game. So everything is generated from the shape and form of levels. So to me, it's very much a game about figuring out how to navigate space in new configurations, and how you're going to create your own path through that space. So I think Explorers isn't so much about stages that look different, so much as it is about stages that are distinct because of where the background is, where the ground is that you're trying to navigate around and through.
Right, okay. Because the characters have different abilities based on the space that they destroy or create, so that's kind of the language that the game is dealing in, is where it gets its variety.
It's all about navigation through space. It's all about really a sense of where you are in that space and where you need to get to.
Okay, yeah. So actually, on that note, the spacing in Explobers is pretty clearly marked. You have that tiled background, and whenever you walk your little Explober fellow around, he highlights in the background where it'll do something. So if you have a red one active, it'll show you the space that will be destroyed if you activate it, and the same with the blue block. With the blue Explober, it'll show you where the block will be created.
Mm.
And it works on a tile by tile grid, so it's pretty clear. You're never fuzzy on where your thing will take place. But on the other hand, it is a puzzle platformer, which means that these are characters that jump through space and are subject to gravity. And because of that, sometimes the timing can be tricky. Like you'll want to jump over a pit and activate an Explober. And so, because of the speed of gravity, hitting one particular tile might be a matter of frames, and it can be kind of tricky to be 100% accurate. So, I guess first off, how strict would you say Explobers is in regards to timing your actions?
It is very strict at a certain level of play, I think. I've actually gone in to the game and released a subsequent rebalancing patch since my initial release, because I thought it was a little too strict in certain places. So I created leeway in terms of the amount of chances that you have. It's still a pretty strict game, and a lot of that strictness does come down to timing.
When you say leeway in the number of chances, do you just mean the number of Explobers that would be in a level?
Yes, it's all about the number of lives each Explober has in each stage.
Okay.
Because when for people who haven't played the game, you have like 3 red Explobers, you have 5 green ones, you have 2 blue ones, and that's basically how many lives each one has. And so whether they fall into a pit of spikes and die, or they hit a laser, or they actually use their power, that count goes down 1. So one of the challenges is trying to figure out not just how do I get from point A to point B, but how do I do it with this finite amount of resources, much like a Lemmings sort of level. And so I asked the player to jump into spike pits. I asked the player to hit a wall that's going to they hit it at a certain height so they can actually create a hole that they can use to get to the target up above. And it's a very strict game about timing. It's that's kind of one of the ideas I had going into the making of it. A lot of puzzle platformers tend to be more strict about timing than mine is.
Okay. And the website for Explobers does describe the levels in the game as puzzles. Do you think that the timing element plays into the puzzleness of levels, or would you say it's more of an offset? Or, I guess, how would you describe the role of real-time challenges in a game about puzzles?
That's a great question. Because a lot of puzzle games, you can set the table and be like, okay, if I just do this, 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 and this, you don't really have to worry too much about the timing. One of my major inspirations going into this game was Lemmings, which is also can be very much about like trying to hit that button at just the right moment, frustratingly so. Which having watched a bunch of people play it at SAM last week, I got to witness a lot of people find that frustratingly so in my game as well, hitting that block button just right before they hit the spike pit so they can actually create the bridge that they want to create at a low level. So it's an interesting question of genre. Is it an offset, or I guess it's a question of kind of Twitch gameplay can be considered a aspect of a puzzle game, or if it is somehow like outside the genre. I think because it's there and it is a puzzle game, and is part of how you succeed at the puzzles, it very much is part of the puzzle structure. Especially later in the game, you start running into bullets, and there's bullet patterns, and that I think adds a whole other level of timing. And so you have to timing is it's something that kind of starts kind of slowly feeding the player. I feel like after the first dozen stages, timing becomes more and more important to the point that later stages have become largely about timing. One of the aspects in my level design tool bag.
Okay, cool. I also noticed that the expert challenges often required me to place Explobers just so, using my best timing. So, was that your intention with the expert challenges to differentiate between the good timers and the not as good timers? Or would you say that the expert challenges bring out other aspects of gameplay as well?
Um, yeah, the challenges kind of enabled me to make my cruelest, most exacting puzzles while also allowing them to exist in other forms of this simultaneously. This actually came out of when I was doing some testing and getting feedback from some friends. I had a small pool of testers who played the game for me. I was creating these really, really almost impossible to achieve unless you do exactly what I had in mind sort of puzzles, placing them in just the right place, which also meant that, it's not just you have to get the placement right, but you can't mess up your platforming and let them fall off a ledge and make them useless, because then you can't complete the stage. So that ended up kind of being a reconciliation between my desire to create like the hardest puzzles possible and being able to actually be accomplished by people who don't think exactly the way that I'm thinking. Um, so it allowed me to kind of split it. So I have kind of the normal play. It's like building in a hard mode into the game without actually creating like a separate hard mode. One of the things that's been interesting as I've been getting more and more feedback from players is I've realized that a lot of people, unlike me, are the kind of completionists who, if they see like an expert challenge, or they can get a star, or they can get a trophy for hitting a certain goal, they won't move on until they can actually hit that. Whereas my conception of the expert challenges was that it would be, oh, okay, I can do this now, and then when I come back after beating 50 stages, maybe I can come back and hit the expert challenge because I understand the game better, which is an interesting. People play that differently.
When it comes to performing the expert challenges, trying to place Explobers exactly right, one thing that I find strangely helpful was that, um, personally, there was a matter of internalizing the timing of the movement
Mm.
where, as I would play the game over a couple of days without intentionally practicing as much, I would just gain a greater intuition of where the character would be at any given moment in time through the course of a jump. So, more so than thinking about the solution and trying to come up with something new, it was just that muscle memory that allowed me to go back and get some of the expert challenges that I had missed.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm thinking about that kind of thing. I think about like the beginning of Super Mario Brothers World 4-1, where you have, I think that's the first place in the game where you have to jump off of a platform that is only one block wide, 116 pixel block wide, which is literally impossible until you know how Mario moves well enough that you know that you can hit it and jump at a certain speed to actually get across that pit. Which a certain part of the challenge of any kind of platform, or anything that has like its own kind of mechanics, is just understanding where you're going to be at a given moment. You have to learn that with whatever kind of platforming system you're in.
Yeah, the levels in Explobers have variation through both their level design, but also in the character selection you get because of the three different varieties of Explobers.
Mm.
So, between those two things, were there any underlying concepts that you used over the course of the levels to increase the difficulty? Like, would you say there are any underlying themes or arcs of ideas through the levels?
To answer this question, I might kind of go to, because I'm not entirely sure how to get at what you're asking, though I really like the question. I might start with my general approach to level design for Explobers, especially, which is when I sat down to make a new level. Generally speaking, what I went in with was an idea for motion. That in my mind, I kind of had a image of what kind of motion I wanted the player to perform to accomplish the level, and through that, I would kind of work retroactively to be like, well, to do that, it needs to be a level that's more focused on exploding, or it's a level that, because it's going to be vertical, but I don't want the player to just build a bridge up. I need to think about, which I have plenty of stages where that, yes, you have to mainly build bridges all the way up, but I also have ones where you have to more strategically blast into the sides of things. And so that really dictated what characters I placed into each stage. And that was a lot of balancing. Like, generally speaking, I would start every stage with, I'm just going to dump 12 of each kind in here and then kind of whittle that down based on the kind of solution I imagined the player would come up with to get through. There were stages where I wanted to highlight a certain characteristic. So even though I tried to create as many stages where you have a lot of cooperation between the two or three different kinds, there are some late game stages where, all of a sudden you only have red ones again, and the red one has to do a lot of vertical climbing, and you have to figure out how to use the explosion techniques to go up. And I try to balance the rhythm of the stages as you progress, so you don't like get into, this is the section where I'm doing all of this. This is the section where I'm doing all of this. It was about, all of a sudden I don't have any blocks that I can build. I can only explode. And then the next stage, I have 20 of each. I can really kind of mess around. So it's about creating variation stage to stage.
Okay. So it sounds like two of your key inspirations when designing a level was, first of all, having some idea of motion, whether you want a player to hop back and forth between two sides of a vertical hallway, or whether you want players to jump across a large chasm or something like that. And the other source would be just, given your rule set, which is pretty clearly stated up front, like, what are all of the different attributes that I can vary on? I should say that you mentioned you weren't entirely sure what I was asking, and, well, I think if I knew what I was asking, I wouldn't have asked it, if you know what I mean.
No, I mean, I think I kind of understood what you were asking. I think it was more that I didn't quite know how to answer it, and I was hoping to follow my way to an answer through talking.
Okay.
Perhaps if you don't know what you were asking, perhaps I didn't actually catch it either.
In any kind of art form, there's the idea that elements hang together by some kind of background inspiration idea that doesn't surface explicitly. So I'm always trying to do what I can to pick up on that without imposing myself on the object, trying to ensure that my idea comes before what's in the game itself.
That's interesting. I wonder, because since you had the insight to ask the question, not to turn this back around on you, but I would wonder what sort of metaphysics or like spiritual philosophy do you see like underlying the game? I mean, you've played through a fair portion of it now. What do you see in the game?
Well, definitely there do seem to be. I've only gotten up to level 25, but there do seem to be tropes based on the size of the level and on the number of blocks. Like, there have been at least 3 different levels where you're stuck in a I'm trying to I'm trying to think. So there's a couple of capsule hotel levels in Explobers where you'll be stuck in this grid formation of blocks, and then the red guy is usually your friend there because he can clear all sorts of paths, all sorts of interesting paths through this grid formation. So there are like a couple of repeating tropes like that, and I haven't really played enough for the ideas to fully coalesce yet.
No, that's interesting. I do think, there's a certain stock bag of tricks that I have. And it's not like that I necessarily think about it that way. It's what feels right to me when I'm putting a stage together. So you do get to later stages where, you start in like a box, and perhaps the blue character starts in a box and can't blast itself out of there. So you need to get the red player over to them and blast them out, so then they can start creating the actual path to the end. And so what I'm going for varies from stage to stage. But my favorite moments of the game is when you actually really do like a good synthesis, like a really good sense of cooperation between the characters. Another thing I'd say is that in my mind, there are different kinds of Explober levels as well. And one of them is the kind that's a little bit more representational, where the geography starts to feel a little bit less. I've got stages where I kind of started out off with an image of what the stage could look like in terms of, this is what like a landscape could look like, a very abstracted blue digital looking landscape. But I have one where you go through things that look like statues or images of other things. I have one where you eventually like have to blast your way through a duck sprite that I used in a previous game, a giant version of that.
Yeah, I saw that in the trailer.
What I'm looking for varies from stage to stage. The way that I put the stages together, I don't know if this is interesting, is I just created. Some of the hardest stages in the game were some of the first ones I created, and they ended up getting moved to later in the game. And I just created like 90-some stages and then just whittled it down to 80 and then arranged them. And what I felt like was a good flow when I started playing through them. And so part of that flow was both escalating difficulty, but also asking you to do different things and to use the characters and their very finite abilities in different ways from stage to stage. So you're not just rehashing, hey, here's this kind of obstacle, I know what I need to do with this. But repurposing those obstacles and repurposing the placements to constantly ask you to think about what they can do with these very, I say they have all these different abilities, but there's really two different abilities spread across three characters, and figuring out how to recombine those elements to what different ways they can be used.
Okay. So there's kind of maybe this is kind of a crude way to put it, but it's almost like there's a nested loop of, the broader loop is a loop of difficulty, and within that, for each step of difficulty, you might go through a series of unique interactions that the Explobers have.
Absolutely, and it's not that sub loop is not as rigorously thought out as the larger loop, I guess, because I'm not like, it's not like a 1-2, 1-3, 1-4 kind of progression where you did this and now next one's gonna be this kind of stage, but kind of on a macro scale, it loops that way, I think. That was my intention, anyway.
And about the green Explober in specific, the first time I saw him, it was pretty exciting because this guy can do anything I want. But then, as I got to see him more, it became more of a liability, where I noticed, I don't know if I want this guy to blow up or if I want him to create a block. So I was curious, do you see the green Explober as opening up opportunities, like letting the player do whatever they want to solve the puzzle? Or do you see it as more of a restriction where the player needs to use their reason to figure out, I gotta use the green guy in this way?
I'm delighted by what you just told me, because I want to create that anxiety for the player. So yeah, I guess. I mean, when I first introduced the green one into the game, I wanted to create that. Now I can make choices, and it's a lot of freedom. But then that freedom starts to feel more like you said, a liability, because you don't know whether it should explode. You don't know whether it should become a block. And you don't know when to save it for. Should I actually run through it at the beginning? Should I run through it toward the end? When I start, as the game progresses, things where it becomes really helpful for you that the Explorers can actually stand on top of each other and serve as temporary platforms for each other. And so, keeping one alive and not exhausting any of them boosts the total remaining count at the end, which makes it possible to get a better score in terms of the expert clears. So ultimately, for me, it was about not holding the player's hand and being like, okay, so to do this, you're going to have 18 explosions and 6 blocks. You're going to have at least 4 explosions, at least 4 blocks, and then 20, I don't know, Um, I keep going back to Lemmings because Lemmings is one of my fixations. Often the challenge of later Lemmings levels is, oh, I have 2 umbrellas and 6 bridges, and that's all I can do. So how do I do that in this space? Mine kind of turns that on its head and says, oh, I can do all of this. Which one do I actually need to do? On stages where you have the green one present. So I enjoy creating that kind of anxiety. And so it's more about making the player really think. If you aren't trying to go for that expert clear and there are green ones present, where you can save a few for the end, and then you're like, well, I don't have to make up my mind till the end as to where they're going to go. So if you're playing more caustically, I think the green one can be kind of liberating. If you're really trying to play conservatively, and depending on the stage, if it's really strict in its requirements, then it can be something that you have to use very, very deliberately.
Even at that point, you run into some subtle circumstances where I noticed I would save the green ones, like you said, but then if you use up all the other Explobers, then you can't jump on them. So you also want to spread out what you use them for.
Yeah, and watching people play last weekend, it was really interesting to see different people do different things with them, where they're like, oh, well, I can just save all these to the end, and then they realize, oh, no, but this was predicated on having a red one, having 2 different kinds available at the end, so I could jump over that last one, and realizing and then they just hit the restart button and throw their head up.
Yeah, there's just enough going on where, like, if I sit down and think through each thing, I know everything that's going on, but trying to work through the process and actually implement a solution, it's hard to juggle all of the bits of information in my brain.
It's a game that wants you to be paying attention to multiple spaces, not just multiple spaces where the characters are, but multiple spaces where they're eventually going to have to be. So you can't create a block here, because if you create a block here, how are you going to get up that passage eventually? Be thinking kind of in multiple spaces and multiple times, kind of seeing the journey holistically each stage, at least in the more complicated stages. That's something that I found really exciting about putting stages together for this game.
Okay. Are there any topics we haven't covered yet that you would like to?
I'd love to talk just a little bit about the characters themselves. Where this came from a doodle involving... I've always drawn these little characters with little eyes, and they're kind of little shapes. And realizing that of these characters being kind of nervous. Like one of the first ideas I had for the game was have them have these little idle animations that they have. Where I hope the thing that comes across with those animations is that they're insecure and scared. Which with a game where you're actually having to sacrifice them continually to achieve your goal is, I don't know if that's just sadistic on my part, but I wanted them to be cute and also kind of grotesque and also kind of pathetic. I had a lot of fun with that. To me, trying to figure out, sometimes I come up with a mechanical idea when I'm putting together a game and I'm not sure what it should look like, which is one of the reasons I often try to nail down the characters first so I can start to figure out what the whole visual theme of the world I'm trying to inhabit and the mechanics. And coming up with these guys right from the beginning was a lot of fun because they're cute, they're kind of weird looking, and at least that's what I was aiming for.
You mentioned that it was a little bit like turning Lemmings on its head at one point, and in Lemmings the point is to save as many guys as possible, whereas in Explober, it's a given that to get through any stage you have to intentionally kill your guys.
Yeah. Whereas in Lemmings, like the idea often is that the only ones that you're really going to end up sacrificing, hopefully, are the blockers that you have to put up, and eventually you have to blow them up. And maybe you have to like strategically blow up someone to like break through a platform, but otherwise you're trying to save as many as possible. Yeah, there's a lot of ways that I think of this game as kind of an inverted Lemmings, and that's definitely one of them. That's kind of a joy, because everybody likes to blow up the Lemmings, right? I mean, that's as much as you like them, as much as you're trying to save them, it's kind of fun to watch them explode. Here, you just know that they're not going to make it. You only need to make one, whereas most Lemming stages you have to make a certain percentage. Making most of the Lemmings that you get through a stage irrelevant, because you only need to get the one beyond the minimum number. It's just thrilling to see that many. and make it feel like an accomplishment. This feels a lot more like you're not saving a crowd so much as just barely scraping by.
So last but not least, when it comes to video games, which do you consider the most important? The intention of the designer, the experience of the player, or the game itself?
That's a really interesting question, and it's really kind of the middle of that. Like if we create like a triangle that has the three things, the answer is somewhere right in the center, right in the dead center, because a game is nothing without a personality and a creativity behind it. A game can't possibly have a personality to be interesting if it doesn't have something like that buoying it up. A game doesn't exist if it is not experienced by a player. And maybe that's really where the middle is, that the game itself kind of exists between those two things. So I guess maybe if I had to pick, if this was a multiple choice question and I had to pick one of the three, I would say the game itself, in that I think the game itself is constituted by the other two options. And games can exist along various spectrums. And I think there are definitely games that are more interesting because they are not as concerned with the experience of the player, that are more about almost a kind of poem in game form, of just like pure creative expression. There are games that really benefit from more of a focus on player experience, extreme testing and extreme evaluation for, is the player having fun at any given moment? And for me, it varies from project to project as well. Though I think my philosophy, I want to make the things that I want to make, and I want to make them ways that I want to players, and also unpleasurable in the ways that I want them to be to players. And then, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So is there anything you would like to plug before we go?
I would love to tell people to check out Explobers, but also to check out my other games. If you go to my website, if I can plug my website, whatnot.bomb.com.net. That's whatnot.bomb.net. I've got 92 games that I've made over the past 21 years. If you click on recommended games near the top, that'll give you a list of the games of mine that I think are most worth playing. I recently put out something called Temple of the Wumpus, which is my most narrative-focused game in many a year. Contains all my thoughts on spirituality, and I'd love people to check that game out. Also kind of instead of inverting lemmings, that one's kind of a redirection of kind of the ideas behind Hunt the Wumpus, about old games and kind of messing with those. So a game that's Hunt the Wumpus, but it's not about violence, it's about praying. So I'd love for people to check those out.
Cool. Thank you. Definitely will do.
I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. It's been really fun.
Yeah, definitely. Same here.